In the summer of 1939, Hermann Göring stood before a crowd of Luftwaffe officers and made a promise that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If an enemy bomber ever reached the Ruhr, he declared, they could call him Meyer, a common German surname meant to suggest the impossible. Some versions of the boast were even bolder. If a single Allied aircraft reached German soil, his name wasn't Hermann Göring. The officers applauded. The Reichsmarshal, resplendent in his custom-designed uniform heavy with medals, smiled with absolute confidence. He had built what he believed was an invincible air force. 4 years later, he would sit in a bunker listening to reports of 1,000-bomber raids, and the bitter irony of that promise would be inescapable. The first cracks in the Luftwaffe's invincibility appeared over the English Channel in 1940, when the Battle of Britain forced Göring to admit his fighters couldn't establish air superiority over southern England. But that was a foreign sky, and the German public never saw the defeat firsthand. The bombers still couldn't reach Germany in meaningful numbers. The Luftwaffe still controlled the skies over the Reich. Göring's boast still seemed safe. But in the offices of the Air Ministry in Berlin, a few men were beginning to understand that the mathematics of industrial warfare were turning against them. Adolf Galland, a fighter ace who would rise to become General der Jagdflieger, the general of fighter pilots, watched the attrition rates with growing alarm. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots in Russia, in North Africa, in defensive operations over occupied Europe. Every loss was a man who couldn't be easily replaced. Every veteran who went down took years of combat experience with him. In August 1943, the American 8th Air Force launched a massive daylight raid against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg. The Americans came in waves, their B-17 flying fortresses bristling with machine guns, flying in tight defensive formations. The Luftwaffe threw everything available at them. German fighters attacked from every angle, pressing through the defensive fire, ramming when ammunition ran out. The Americans lost 60 bombers that day, nearly 600 men killed or captured. It seemed like a devastating defeat for the attackers. Göring's staff presented it as a great victory, but Galland saw something different in the reports. The Americans had come back. Despite the losses, despite the carnage, they had returned to their bases in England and would come again. And the Luftwaffe had lost dozens of experienced fighter pilots, men who had taken years to train, men who couldn't be replaced at the rate they were dying. 2 months later, the Americans returned to Schweinfurt. This time, they lost 77 bombers in a single day, a massacre that would be remembered as Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force had to suspend deep penetration raids for months. Once again, it looked like a German victory. Once again, Göring's staff celebrated. But in the fighter squadrons, the pilots knew better. They had seen the American formations, seen how the bombers kept coming despite the losses, seen the determination in the way the Americans pressed on to their targets. Major Heinz Baer, an ace with over 200 victories, told his fellow pilots that the Americans were learning. Every raid taught them something, every loss made them adjust their tactics, and most importantly, they had the industrial capacity to replace their losses. Germany didn't. The real crisis began in late 1943 when American P-51 Mustangs started appearing over Germany, equipped with drop tanks that gave them the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. This changed everything. Before, German fighters could attack the bomber formations with relative impunity, breaking off when fuel ran low, knowing the bombers would be vulnerable for most of their journey. Now, American fighters could stay with the bombers throughout the mission. The hunters had become the hunted. Galland tried to explain this to Göring, tried to make him understand that the Luftwaffe was facing a crisis unlike anything they'd encountered before. Göring dismissed his concerns. The Reichsmarshal had become increasingly detached from operational reality, spending more time at his country estate collecting art than managing the air war. When his commanders brought him bad news, He accused them of cowardice or defeatism. In February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, which would become known as Big Week. For 6 days, American bombers, supported by long-range fighters, hammered German aircraft production facilities and airfields. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, throwing hundreds of fighters into desperate defensive battles. The Americans lost over 200 bombers and their crews. But the Luftwaffe lost something far more precious. Over 300 fighter pilots were killed or missing in those 6 days, including some of Germany's most experienced aces. The commander of one fighter wing wrote in his diary that they had lost in less than a week what would normally take months to replace, and they couldn't replace these men at all. The Americans had killed the instructors, the veterans, the men who knew how to survive in air combat and could teach others. Galland requested an urgent meeting with Göring. He brought production figures, casualty reports, and a stark analysis. The Luftwaffe was losing the war of attrition. Fighter production was actually increasing. Germany was building more fighters than ever before. But they couldn't train pilots fast enough to fly them. Before the war, a fighter pilot received over 2 years of training, accumulating hundreds of hours in the air before seeing combat. Now, they were sending boys up with barely 50 hours of flight time, throwing them against American pilots who had 10 times that experience. These novice pilots were dying on their first or second missions, sometimes without scoring a single kill. The veterans who survived were flying multiple missions per day, exhausted, watching their squadrons fill with teenagers who barely knew how to fly. Göring's response was to accuse Galland of defeatism. The Reichsmarshal, who had once been a fighter pilot himself, who had won the Pour le Mérite in the First World War, seemed unable to process the reality his subordinates were describing. He blamed the fighter pilots for cowardice. He claimed they weren't pressing their attacks aggressively enough. In one infamous meeting, he suggested that fighter pilots were afraid to engage the enemy. Galland, normally disciplined and respectful of rank, nearly lost control. He reminded Göring that these pilots were flying multiple missions per day against overwhelming odds, that they were dying at a rate that would destroy the fighter force within months. Göring dismissed him. The meeting ended with nothing resolved. On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. That morning, the Luftwaffe managed to fly exactly 2 sorties over the invasion beaches. 2 aircraft out of what had once been the most powerful air force in the world. The Allies flew over 14,000 sorties that day. 14,000. German troops on the ground looked up at skies completely dominated by Allied aircraft. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, all flying with impunity. When reports reached Hitler's headquarters, the Führer demanded to know where the Luftwaffe was. Göring had no answer. The fighter units were still in Germany, still trying to defend against the bomber offensive, still bleeding out in daily battles against American escorts. They couldn't be everywhere at once, and Hitler's strategy had forced them to prioritize defending German cities over supporting the armies in France. Galland flew to Normandy himself to assess the situation. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. German ground forces were being systematically destroyed from the air. Every road movement brought Allied fighter bombers. Every concentration of troops drew immediate attack. The Wehrmacht was learning to move only at night, to hide during the day, to fear the sky. Galland returned to Germany and wrote a report that was brutally honest. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe. They could not defend the armies in France. They could not stop the bomber offensive against Germany. They were fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts with inadequate resources and insufficient pilots. He recommended a complete reorganization of priorities, a focus on producing more fighters and training more pilots, even if it meant reducing bomber production to 0. The report went to Göring, who filed it away without action. It went to Hitler, who read it and flew into a rage. The Führer didn't want to hear about limitations or defeats. He wanted to hear about wonder weapons and counter-offensives. He wanted to hear that the Luftwaffe would rise again and sweep the Allies from the sky. When Galland tried to explain the mathematical reality that Germany was being outproduced and outfought, Hitler accused him of defeatism. The meeting ended with Hitler screaming that he would find commanders who believed in victory, who had the will to fight. Galland left the meeting knowing that rational military planning was no longer possible. By autumn 1944, the situation had become catastrophic. The Allies were bombing Germany around the clock. The British came at night with area bombing raids against cities. The Americans came during the day with precision attacks against industrial targets. The Luftwaffe's day fighter force was being destroyed faster than it could be rebuilt. Experienced pilots were dying at a rate of dozens per week. New pilots were being shot down before they learned basic combat survival skills. The fighter units were becoming graveyards for teenagers. One Luftwaffe commander wrote that they were sending lambs to slaughter, that the boys arriving at his base looked like children, that he could see the fear in their eyes when they learned they'd be flying against American Mustangs the next morning. The fuel situation made everything worse. Allied bombing had crippled Germany's synthetic fuel production. The Luftwaffe was running out of aviation gasoline. Pilots were receiving minimal training because there wasn't enough fuel for practice flights. Units were grounded because they couldn't fuel their aircraft. When they did manage to get planes in the air, pilots had to conserve fuel, couldn't maneuver freely, couldn't use full throttle in combat. American pilots noticed that German fighters were flying more cautiously, breaking off engagements earlier, avoiding prolonged dogfights. They were running out of gas. In November 1944, Göring gave a speech to his fighter commanders that revealed how completely he had lost touch with reality. He blamed them for the Luftwaffe's failures. He suggested they lacked courage, that they weren't fighting hard enough, that they were making excuses. The men in that room, veterans with hundreds of combat missions, men who had watched their friends die, men who flew every day knowing they probably wouldn't survive the war, sat in stunned silence. Some were openly crying with rage and frustration. After the speech, several commanders approached Galland and said they couldn't continue serving under Göring. The Reichsmarshal had betrayed them, had blamed them for a situation he had created through his incompetence and his refusal to face reality. In January 1945, a group of senior fighter commanders confronted Göring directly in what became known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt. They demanded that Göring resign or at least step aside and let competent officers run the air war. They presented evidence of his failures, his poor decisions, his detachment from operational reality. Göring's response was to have Galland removed from command. The general, who had been trying to save the Luftwaffe, was relieved of his position, effectively ending any chance of rational reform. Hitler approved the decision. The Führer had lost faith in the fighter pilots, blamed them for failing to stop the bomber offensive, refused to acknowledge that the task had become impossible. By this point, German cities were being systematically destroyed. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, every major industrial center was being pounded into rubble. The civilian population was living in basements and bomb shelters, emerging after raids to find their neighborhoods transformed into moonscapes of rubble and ash. The Luftwaffe could do nothing to stop it. On days when they managed to intercept bomber formations, they might shoot down a few dozen aircraft, but hundreds more got through. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The Allies could replace their losses. Germany couldn't. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, understood the situation with painful clarity. He had the economic data, the production figures, the damage assessments. He knew that Germany's industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed, that the war economy was collapsing, that continued fighting was pointless. He tried repeatedly to convince Hitler to negotiate an end to the war. He brought reports showing the bombing damage, the production shortfalls, the resource constraints. Hitler refused to look at them. The Führer had retreated into fantasy, talking about wonder weapons that would turn the tide, about armies that existed only on paper, about victories that were impossible. Speer later wrote that the most frustrating aspect of those final months was watching rational discussion become impossible. Hitler wouldn't accept bad news. Göring was living in a drug-addled fantasy world. The other Nazi leaders were either true believers who refused to acknowledge reality or cynics who were planning their escapes. The military commanders who understood the situation were either removed from command or learned to keep silent. The machinery of government had broken down into a cult of personality where truth was whatever the Führer wanted to hear. The Luftwaffe's final major operation was Operation Bodenplatte on January 1st, 1945. The plan was to launch a massive surprise attack against Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland, destroying aircraft on the ground and buying time for the Wehrmacht. The Luftwaffe assembled nearly 900 fighters, a huge force by the standards of late-war Germany. They achieved complete surprise, catching the Allies unprepared on New Year's morning. German fighters strafed parked aircraft, destroyed hangars, caused significant damage. For a few hours, it looked like the old Luftwaffe had returned. But the cost was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost over 200 aircraft and nearly 150 pilots. Many were shot down by Allied anti-aircraft fire. Others were lost to accidents, pilots with minimal training who couldn't navigate back to base or who crashed while landing. Some were shot down by German anti-aircraft batteries who hadn't been informed of the operation and fired on their own aircraft. The Allies replaced their losses within days. The Luftwaffe never recovered. The fighter force that flew on January 1st was the last major concentration of German air power. After Bodenplatte, there was nothing left. In the final months of the war, Göring essentially disappeared. He spent his time at Kernau, his estate, surrounded by stolen art and morphine. He gave orders that bore no relation to reality, demanded operations that were impossible, blamed everyone but himself for the Luftwaffe's collapse. Hitler had long since written him off, had stopped inviting him to military conferences, had begun referring to him with contempt. The man who had built the Luftwaffe, who had promised that enemy bombers would never reach Germany, was a broken, delusional figure, hiding from the consequences of his failures. Galland, stripped of his command, was given permission to form an elite jet fighter unit, Jagdverband 44. He gathered some of Germany's best surviving aces and flew the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter in the war's final weeks. The Me-262 was a revolutionary aircraft, fast enough to outrun Allied fighters, heavily armed enough to destroy bombers with a single pass. In the hands of experts like Galland, it was devastating. But there were too few of them, they arrived too late, and they couldn't change the outcome. Galland flew combat missions until the end, shot down several Allied aircraft, and survived the war. He later wrote that the Me-262 was a glimpse of what might have been if Germany had made different decisions earlier in the war, if they had prioritized fighter production, if they had listened to the men who understood air warfare. The final admission came not in a dramatic speech or official announcement, but in silence. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, as American and British armies advanced from the west, the Luftwaffe simply ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. There was no fuel for the aircraft that remained. There were no experienced pilots to fly them. The infrastructure that supported air operations had been bombed into rubble. Individual units might still fly missions, individual pilots might still take off to engage the enemy, but there was no longer a Luftwaffe in any meaningful sense. When Göring was captured by American forces in May 1945, he tried to negotiate special treatment, still believing he was an important figure who deserved respect. The Americans treated him as just another prisoner. At the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors presented evidence of the Luftwaffe's collapse, of the bomber offensive's success, of the systematic destruction of German cities. Göring, defending himself, tried to argue that the Luftwaffe had fought bravely, that they had been overwhelmed by superior numbers, that no air force could have withstood the Allied onslaught. He was partly right. But he never acknowledged his own role in the disaster, never admitted that his poor decisions, his refusal to face reality, his detachment from operational command had accelerated the Luftwaffe's destruction. Albert Speer, also at Nuremberg, was more honest. He testified that the bombing campaign had been devastatingly effective, that it had crippled German war production, that it had made continued resistance impossible. He described meetings where he had tried to convince Hitler to end the war, where he had presented evidence of the hopeless situation, where the Führer had refused to listen. Speer accepted responsibility for his role in the Nazi regime, admitted that the leadership had failed Germany. He served 20 years in Spandau prison and spent the rest of his life writing about the collapse of the Third Reich, trying to understand how rational men had allowed themselves to participate in such catastrophic decisions. Galland survived the war, was interrogated by Allied intelligence officers who were intensely interested in his perspective on the air war. He was frank in his assessments, explained the Luftwaffe's failures, described the internal conflicts and poor decisions. He wrote a memoir, The First and the Last, that became one of the most important first-hand accounts of the air war from the German perspective. In it, he documented the meetings with Göring and Hitler, the arguments over strategy, the desperate final months. He was critical of the leadership but respectful of the pilots who had fought under impossible conditions. His book made clear that the Luftwaffe's defeat wasn't due to cowardice or lack of skill, but to strategic failures, industrial inadequacy, and leadership that refused to acknowledge reality until it was far too late. The men who flew for the Luftwaffe, the pilots and crews who died defending German skies, never got to make official statements about the High Command's failures. They died in burning aircraft over their own cities, watching the bombers they couldn't stop continue to their targets. They died knowing their leaders had failed them, had sent them into battles they couldn't win with inadequate training and insufficient support. Some left letters or diaries that survived the war, documents that expressed their frustration, their awareness that they were being sacrificed for nothing, their anger at commanders who blamed them for defeats that were inevitable. One such letter, written by a fighter pilot who died in late 1944, survived because his mother kept it. He wrote that he knew he wouldn't survive the war, that the odds were impossible, that every day more experienced pilots died and were replaced by boys who didn't know how to fight. He wrote that he was angry, not at the enemy, but at the leaders who had put Germany in this position, who had started a war they couldn't win, who refused to negotiate an end even when defeat was obvious. He wrote that he would keep flying because his comrades were flying, because the cities below needed whatever protection they could provide, because surrender felt like betrayal. But he wanted his mother to know that he understood the war was lost, that his death would accomplish nothing, that the leadership had failed everyone. That letter captured what many Luftwaffe pilots felt in the final year of the war but couldn't say publicly. They understood the situation better than their commanders did. They saw the American formations growing larger, saw the Allied fighters becoming more numerous and aggressive, saw their own squadrons shrinking. They did the mathematics in their heads, calculated their odds of survival, and kept flying anyway. Not because they believed in victory, but because they couldn't abandon their comrades, couldn't leave the cities undefended, couldn't find a way to stop fighting that didn't feel like cowardice. The realization that the Luftwaffe could no longer protect Germany didn't come in a single moment or dramatic announcement. It came gradually, in a series of defeats and failures that accumulated until the truth was undeniable. It came in the reports Galland filed that Göring ignored. It came in the meetings where Speer presented bombing damage assessments that Hitler dismissed. It came in the silence of fighter pilots who knew they were dying for nothing but couldn't say so. It came in the skies over German cities, where civilians looked up and saw only enemy aircraft, where the promised protection had vanished. When German High Command finally acknowledged what had happened, when they finally admitted that the Luftwaffe had lost the air war, it was too late to matter. The admission came in surrender documents, in testimony at war crimes trials, in memoirs written by survivors trying to explain the catastrophe. It came in the ruins of German cities, in the millions of dead, in the complete destruction of the Reich that Göring had promised to defend. The words spoken in 1939, the boast that enemy bombers would never reach Germany, had become the cruelest joke of the war. They had reached Germany, they had destroyed Germany, and the man who promised they never would had no answer except silence and denial.